Good afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland and this week's Full Scottish. My name is Isla Barker. On the programme this week, we are delighted to be joined by Linda Fabiani. Good afternoon, Linda. And also delighted to welcome back Mark Hooper, who is running for Plaid Cymru in the Senate. Good afternoon, Mark.
Prynhawn da from Wales. Good to be back.
So, starting with our Middle East update. 749 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza since the start of the October 2025 ceasefire, bringing the total number of Palestinians killed in Gaza since October 7, 2023 to 72,328. Israel has continued its deadly attacks on Lebanon, where their death toll has risen to 2,020. Talks between the US and Iran and Pakistan ended without agreement, and the Strait of Hormuz remains closed, despite Trump claiming to have sent minesweepers to clear water mines. So, Linda, with J.D. Vance being involved in these talks instead of Donald Trump, what do you think this says about the president at this time during this conflict?
Wouldn't we like to know? My first thought was that he wanted Vance out of the way. Vance has, not that I believe anything Vance says either, but Vance has always said he's anti-war, he doesn't want aggression, and I wondered if maybe there was a bit of internal conflict going on there, so Trump just wanted him out of the way. But I don't know. I mean, I listened to Vance this morning talking about the breakdown of talks, and his language was bullish, very much the current US administration type of language. And I'm not a fan of any of them. But I do think there's a lot of internal stuff going on there that we're not hearing about. Yeah. Within MAGA, within the US government, between Trump and those supposedly closest to him. I think Trump's just completely deranged. Whether some of those round about him are starting to perhaps be worried about it, I don't know.
Do you think this could lead to impeachment or a vote of no confidence?
It could, of course it could. It always could. I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure. But I mean, they've got the midterms coming up, later on this year, so they'll be trying to keep a lid on everything. Mm-hmm. But as I say, I think Trump's just becoming more and more deranged as days go by. Vance must see that. I don't know whether to be more worried about a bad person that's deranged or a bad person that knows exactly what they're doing. And this seems to be the choice that we now have with those at the top of the US government.
I see. And Mark, what do you think about the talks breaking down or J.D. Vance's increasingly powerful role within negotiations from America during this conflict?
I think, picking up on Linda's points, I think we're in a situation where this is all going a bit crazy. We've got a presidency that's fallen off the edge of a cliff. I don't think we're going to get to impeachment. I think that's some way off. So I think we've got a long way before these things resolve themselves. But we've got a president who changes his mind every minute, needs walking down from really serious places by other countries. A few days ago he was planning to obliterate Iran and the Iranian people. So we've got some real problems that we need to consider, but it's playing out and it's affecting everyone else in the world's lives, including here in Scotland and Wales and the rest of the UK. We've got situations where it's becoming increasingly costly to go and fill up your car, which is all as a result of, an unnecessary war. I still think that, the UK even in a small part, with allowing the Americans to use the bases is a strategic mistake. You look at what's happening in Spain, where they've taken a much more robust take on it. I think is the better way. But we're living in a world where the most powerful person in the world is increasingly, deranged is the right word I think that Linda used earlier.
And so with the growing pressure on the defence capabilities of the UK, with not just the war in Ukraine, but also the war in Iran, how do you think, let's start with Wales and Plaid Cymru, how could the party pressure Westminster to boost defence spending or diplomacy to prevent any further escalations or involvements of the UK in any international conflicts?
So it's interesting that you characterise those two choices, and I'm not sure they're the right choices. I think just increasing defence spending isn't a way that reduces the heat and the pressure of this. It's a cauldron. I think diplomacy is where we need to start, and diplomacy is where we need to end. The problem is, as I said earlier, we've got the most powerful. You've got Trump on one side, Putin on the other. These are men who don't really care for the international order, don't care for the rules that cover that. So they're difficult people to deal with. But when you spend too much time, acquiescing with them and helping them to do what they do, then we're not actually solving the problem. I think the UN probably is where it needs to become more robust. I'd love it if Wales had its own seat in the UN and we could talk about it ourselves. But given we're not at the moment, then I would expect more from the UK to put pressure on the US in particular. And then you've got to look at those people who are aligning with. We've got a big change going on in Hungary by the looks of things, which I think could change the dynamic in terms of support for Putin as well. But these are, we look from the side and we're not in the midst of this. But at the end of this, if diplomacy fails, it's absolutely horrific for the people who are caught in the middle, and that's something that we should all bear in mind. That's why these things go wrong. This is a horrific place for those people who are caught in it.
Yeah.
And so then with Scotland, how do you think they can boost their diplomatic capabilities?
Well, it's interesting. It's difficult in the devolved settlement. I don't know the detail, obviously. I'm not part of the discussions, but I did read something from Scotland's First Minister, John Swinney, the other day, expressing annoyance, great concern that Scotland wasn't even getting included in any of the discussions at all, completely ignored. And I presume that it's the same in Wales. No reason to think it would be otherwise. So that is an ongoing frustration. And, when you have a UK that is ignoring the devolved representation and carrying on in their way, there's not an awful lot you can do, because at the end of the day, it's their responsibility and they will do it regardless of what you think. And the settlements we have also mean that they can overrule anything Scotland or Wales wants to do anyway. So my vision that I see for Scotland is as an independent nation, focusing on diplomacy, as Mark said. We should never stop talking. Got to keep talking. International institutions have to be respected and strengthened.
Yes, of course.
There are concerns about the UN, but I'm so glad they're there. They seem pretty useless at the moment, but it is keeping others together. Same with the EU. Links amongst nations are so very, very important in the world we live in. I would see Scotland as a peaceful nation. I would think we should have our own defence, of course we should, but I would see our role more in peacekeeping and in diplomacy and being able to be a good player upon the world stage. That's what I want. I don't want to be part of the UK that makes decisions and enters into illegal wars, which we've had, and helps others in illegal wars.
Of course, yes. And now, speaking of other conflicts, we move on to our Ukraine update. So Russia and Ukraine on Saturday accused each other of violating a brief ceasefire in their 4-year-old war, hours into the truce put in place to mark Orthodox Easter. Governors of two Russian border regions said Ukrainian drones had attacked targets in the Kursk and Belgorod regions, injuring 5 people. The General Staff of Ukraine's military said Russian forces had violated the terms of the 32-hour truce through assault actions, shelling, and drone strikes. In total, the Ukrainian military said on Saturday had seen Russia carry out 57 airstrikes and drop 182 guided aerial bombs, along with deploying 3,928 drones and conducting 2,454 shelling attacks on populated areas and positions of our troops. In Russia's Kursk region, Governor Alexander Kinstein also accused Kyiv of breaking the 32-hour truce by attacking a gas station in the town of Lugov with a drone. Despite tensions over the truce, the warring sides exchanged 175 prisoners of war each on Saturday, according to officials from both sides. Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine had brought home 175 servicemen and 7 civilians from Russian captivity. President Zelensky, in his nightly video address, made no reference to alleged ceasefire violations. The Ukrainian president repeated that Ukraine would stick to the truce and wished it could be in effect longer. Hungarians vote on Sunday in an election that could end Prime Minister Viktor Orban's 16-year hold on power. For Ukraine, Hungary's eastern neighbour, an Orban defeat could mean the unblocking of a €90 billion European Union loan, vital for Kiev's war effort. It would also deprive Russia of its closest ally in the EU. So, Linda, with the Ukraine conflicts continuing for its now 1,509th day and the Hungarian elections, do you think there is a chance that this this desired result could come through?
I don't know. Mark mentioned earlier about Putin and Trump. Two men who are astride the world. With the help of Netanyahu, we should never forget about him and his role in being a war criminal, in my opinion. Bad players. Now, Orban in Hungary has been very supportive of Putin. Does Putin need him? I'm not sure. I would love to see Orban go. I would love to see a loosening of the regime in in Hungary, and moving away from Russia and Putin's support. But I don't know enough to know whether that would be a big deal for Putin or whether he would just carry on. And what really concerns me about Ukraine is that it's become a bit under the radar. Because Trump's acting in such a terrible, terrible way. I think Putin must be laughing up his sleeve and getting away with all sorts of things. Poor Zelensky, I don't know how that man's coping. And as always, it's ordinary people who are suffering. The people in Ukraine are suffering hugely. People in Lebanon are suffering. Gaza, the suffering's ongoing. And the West Bank's currently been taken over by Netanyahu and his people. Will it make a difference if we get a better government in Hungary? If it's the start of a shift away generally from that kind of right-wing view of the world, yes, that would be a great thing, and I hope it happens. So in the longer term, I think it could make a difference. In the shorter term, I'm just not at all sure.
Okay, of course. And Mark, what do you think of the prospect of the Hungarian elections and its impact on Ukraine?
I think you pointed the thing out earlier in terms of that could unlock a loan from the EU, which they could use for the arms they so desperately need. But I think this testament to this programme, you've given a Ukraine update at every single one of your full breakfasts, and I think so it does try and keep it in people's mind's eye. So I think that's really important and needs to happen. Otherwise, these things do get forgotten. I think we're in a war of attrition now, so it's they're not getting lots of ground every day. These are, it feels like inches by inches that the two sides are either moving forward or moving back. So something like Orban going may prove to be something that becomes pivotal in how things change and bring the sides together and get them to come to an agreement, because ultimately this is futile now. They are fighting over small tracts of land with still people dying every single day on those battlefields as well. So it needs to come to the end. How we could ever countenance somebody in the way that Putin has just taken over another sovereign country and just done it in the way he has. I don't think that they should be rewarded with any of Ukraine's land as well. But I think it comes down to the bloodshed needs to end now, and perhaps this is the start of it. Because I think one of the things that Putin is worried about is the firepower in Ukraine growing, so they have access to weapons that can hit the supply chains coming from Russia into the Ukraine for them, which I think would be a damaging thing. So this, I think there is some hope here, and the sooner Orban goes, the better from my perspective. I think he's part of an axis of these powerful men who feel they have a right to rule the world with an iron fist, and I think the sooner those people aren't in power, the better.
Of course. And moving on further to the election in Hungary, Voters in Hungary are at the polls today in an election which could have a major impact on the future of the EU and Russia's war on Ukraine, and could see the tide turn against the populist right. Polling has suggested that long-term Prime Minister Viktor Orban could lose to Peter Magyar. So the results would come out in UK time at about 7 o'clock tonight. Now, there has been a recent shift towards the far right in several European countries. So let's start with Mark. How could Plaid Cymru turn the tide against the far right in this upcoming election?
So I think it's worth just taking a step back and understanding, why the far right feel that they can come into these elections with some power. And some of this is about delivery and people feeling that public services don't work in the way they should. And when that happens, people then easily encouraged to punch down rather than considering how they work together to make things better. So we're in a really dangerous place, and it strikes me that the most important thing that a Plaid Cymru government needs to do is to start deliver improved public services. Unfortunately, our manifesto came out last Thursday, and it is a programme for government that will actually make a material difference to people's lives over the 4 years of that term. So I feel very confident that we can stem that movement to the far right by delivery. And that's got to be the key thing that makes things work. But ultimately, some of this stuff as well is, a lot of the air war that comes around with elections now is fought with misinformation, disinformation, just lies, essentially. And we've got to be hard and fast in taking these people on with their lies. So I think a lot of this is about us toughening up and having these debates on doorsteps, which is what we're doing. We're finding now that when people say they're going to vote for reform, we can actually engage with them and say, well, why is that? What is making you do that? And sometimes when you start to challenge them on the competency of some of these people who are standing for the right, you can start to see their support waning. So I think their vote isn't as hard and fast as they'd like to think, whereas ours in Plaid Cymru is certainly strengthening in these weeks leading up to the election.
Thank you. And Linda, how do you think the SNP can use their influence within Scotland to turn the tide?
Good government, yes. Improvement in public services. And I think I'm really interested in what Mark said about being a bit more robust. I have an ongoing frustration that the SNP government has done very many good things, many good reports about child poverty alleviation, for example. And we have ameliorated some of the worst excesses of Westminster. We've been able to do it, and it's not been easy, but we've done it. But one of my ongoing frustrations is we have a press and media in the UK, some of which actually would appear to be allied to the far right. And even our so-called national broadcaster, the BBC, when you actually look at the amount of times they've had Nigel Farage on political programmes, the amount of times everything that Reform says gets reported at length. Meanwhile, you have at UK level the Greens doing really well. They don't get nearly as much coverage. The same happens in Scotland. The major UK parties get much more airplay than the Scottish government gets. I presume the same happens in Wales. That's a real issue. Mm-hmm. So I think we should also be more robust about challenging the press and media about some of the stances that they take as well.
Yes, and thank you very much. So back to Hungary, JD Vance has also been involved with the elections. They're speaking to the current Prime Minister. So we'll start with Mark again. Do you think he's doing too much, or what do you think JD Vance's place could be with the Hungarian government, if there is any place?
So what was quite interesting, one of the things that Vance said after his trip, he said that there are outside players engaging in the politics of Hungary. Him being an outside player engaged in the politics of Hungary, these people work on different levels of they can just say what they want and not really care about it. I think Vance's visit will make no difference. It looks as from the polls that Orban's going to lose, so I think we're in an improving place if that being the case. But then it's still in the same way as most of us. We need to then in Hungary they need to make sure they deliver for the people, so that the incoming government needs to make sure it's able to deliver. The fact that you've got an American the MAGA movement was all about trying to say, well, we're going to focus on America first, and to spend no forever wars and all these things that came as part of their MAGA movement, and yet they seem to be spending a lot of time trying to destabilise or create wars or whatever. They seem to be doing a lot of things that are outside of the US as well. So, largely I ignore what Vance would have to say. He's under the spell. He's at the whim of Trump. If he has a bad day, you can see Vance disappearing as well. So this is a one-man band who's repeating ourselves again and using Linda's terminology, and I agree with it. With a deranged president.
Yeah, well, I had a wry smile there because I also picked up on Vance's comment about bad outside players, and I thought, well, Americans really don't do irony, do they? Because who's interfering most in the world at the moment are the Americans. But it's that thing about, certainly from Trump and others in MAGA, their belief that they have the right to be deciding for everybody else in the world. And, and we've also got Trump and Putin who seem more and more to me like a partnership about sharing the world. He's been interfering in the Hungarian elections. Of course he has.
In what way?
Well, all the way. In everything. We all know that all over the world, there's talk about Russian interference in elections. I'm pretty sure we've had it in Scotland, certainly had it in the UK. Seem to have a problem with that. So the bad outside players, to them, are only those who don't agree with them. If you don't agree with the way America wants to go, you are bad. And it's a terribly worrying way of looking at the world, because there's no diplomacy in that. It's bullying, plain and simple. And that right that they believe they had. We've seen it in South America. We've seen them doing it there. We're seeing it in the Middle East.
With Maduro and...
Yeah, and we are... Cuba, there's another one that they've decided that they have the right on. And, they're doing it in Europe all the time. I think America, actually, the US, are the bad players, along with Netanyahu and Putin.
Of course. And now moving on to our next topic, I should warn that our next topic contains subjects that some viewers may find distressing. On the 27th of July 2023, 28-year-old Kimberly Milne died after falling from an overpass on the A90 Kingsway west in Dundee. She fell as she tried to escape her violent husband. In a landmark ruling this week, Lee Milne was held to be responsible for his wife's death and was convicted of culpable homicide and domestic abuse offences following a trial in the High Court in Glasgow. Now, Linda, this is the first case of its kind. So, policing is a devolved power in Scotland. How can the SNP government not only prevent incidents like this, but also assist and mitigate domestic violence or general violent sentiment towards partners?
It's been an ongoing thing. I mean, I think the SNP government since 2007 has done quite a lot on domestic abuse and violence issues. I don't often praise the UK government. I do think there is a will there in the current UK government for that as well, I have to say. It's certainly not easy. But there have been very good... In fact, I was quite involved in some of the things that went on with that when I was elected. For example, non-harassment orders and things being an automatic assumption when someone has been in court for domestic violence. This particular case, I think, is very, very important. It's so sad, but I think it's an important ruling because, of course, we work on case law and that will always be considered for any future cases that come along. One disappointment I have in my own government, I have to say, is that when we did the hate crime legislation, misogyny was not noted.
Why was that?
Well, it was felt at the time, I understand, that some of the organisations that work for violence against women, etc., thought that it shouldn't be in the hate crime legislation. I wasn't part of the government, so I wasn't party to all the discussions. But there was then talk of it becoming a standalone offence, and there was a big inquiry carried out by Helena Kennedy, QC, who recommended that misogyny, which is the start, it's the very base of what then goes into violence against women, because it's a complete disrespect for women, was recommended as a standalone offence. That hasn't been enacted in this parliamentary term, and I hope very much it will be looked at again. There's other things going on. For example, John Swinney, I think it was, said during the week that they were going to strengthen up legislation on non-fatal strangulation, for example, and make it a standalone offence, which I know it's a standalone offence in the north of Ireland. I'm not sure about the rest of the UK. Maybe Mark can enlighten us on that. So there are things being done. Publicity campaigns are huge. We have to keep doing that. Education comes into it. I'm not convinced we've got the education part of it right. I'm really concerned at some of the misogyny that goes on and some of the porn that goes on in social media. Disrespect for young girls and women. But also the police. The police are really, really important, and there's been huge strides in Police Scotland. I know this through being a constituency MSP. There have been strides in Police Scotland about a recognition by officers that violence against women, misogyny, domestic violence are not acceptable and should be treated in a very particular way. It's not perfect. I'm not saying it is. I don't think we're at the bad standard that the Metropolitan Police in London are very clearly at in terms of misogyny. But there are bad apples, of course there always are. It's ongoing. It hasn't improved things as fast as I would like to see them improved. In some ways I think we're going backwards. Reference again, social media, the attitude of young men to young women. We've just got to keep at it. We've got to keep plugging away at it. Yeah.
And Mark, so in Wales, as Linda mentioned, are there any laws against non-fatal strangulation or any other standalone offences in domestic violence?
So we don't have policing or criminal justice devolved like you do in Scotland. So we have a situation where we're at the whim of what happens in Westminster. I just, again, associate myself with what Linda said about, I think there is a determination on behalf of the UK government to actually address this issue. But I think, you know, this particular case, there's a huge tragedy to this, which is happening and being played out in homes across the entire breadth of the country and across the rest of the world. And this is largely, I think, being exacerbated by social media. I think that plays a huge negative part in this. And I think the first thing that we need to accept as politicians and therefore move forward is that this is an endemic problem. It's a problem that's getting worse. It's a problem that's creating huge, you know, tragedies upon tragedies upon tragedies. You know, there are times where the number of women who've been killed in domestic abuse gets read out in the House of Commons, which I think it goes. You know, this is off the scale a problem. I think one of the things that we need to do, and we've got it in, so Plaid has made sure that we've got a gender balanced team of politicians going for the Senate this time. And there will be more women elected for Plaid Cymru than men this time, and I think that's good because that starts to set the tone. But it's also a requirement that that more men ally on this particular subject as well, and make sure that we're all working from the same to make sure that this is seen across society as something that needs addressing. But until we recognise how serious it is, how endemic it is, how young boys at a very young age pick up misogyny as a way of life, I think is something that we need to be addressing. So this is from education, from criminal justice, but it's a societal issue. So I'm very worried that this is going to get worse still, which scares me. As a stepfather of three daughters, I think this you see it in everyday life, and it worries me a lot.
So then, how do you think that, we'll start with Wales, how do you think that sexism can be combated in schools? There is a rise of sexist abuse and violence against female pupils and teachers. So what could Wales do to stop this problem as it begins?
I think stop it as it begins is the key point you made there. This is about being able to engage at a very young age in terms of respect and making sure that people understand that we should be respectful of everyone. And I think that's the starting point. But also then, as you start, as young boys start to grow into young men, it's about making sure that they collectively also do the things that are right. And you need boys, teenagers, challenging their peers to make sure that they address issues when they come out, instead of just laughing them off, which is the easy thing to do. We probably just need more brave young teenage boys to be able to stand up to their boorish and aggressive mates often. So I think there's that. But this is just an education piece. But then it's also making sure that the criminal justice system does pick these things up. And this worries me about, we talked about the far right and where their agenda is. I think too often they see hate crime as being a less important crime in things. But this is about, you often find that, what starts as a misogynistic hate crime then leads into a violent crime later on. So it's about making sure that we have the capacity to deal with these crimes instead of suggesting that they're less important than others. And I think the right want to downplay that, which is something we should fight against and make sure that we don't. In Wales, we need the criminal justice system and the policing devolved to us, mainly because we want to be able to move forward on these issues and not be held back by an England that is further to the right on these subjects than we are.
Thank you. And Linda, what do you think the Scottish Government can do?
Well, I think they are doing a lot. There are many programmes through the education system in schools about respect. I can't remember the name of the whole programme, but respect comes into it. I've seen over the years some of the videos, for example, that are used in schools. That stuff's all great. But sometimes it just doesn't seem to get through. It's almost like that happens in school. Outside school, something completely different. And, young people are capable of compartmentalising some of that stuff. And I think it has to be brought into your whole life. This is just a wee example. A young boy thinking it's fun to say terrible things about a girl in school. If we could make him realise that his mum, and these wee laddies tend to love their mums, his mum was once a girl, how would he feel if his mum had been treated like that? Personal. Was being treated like that. Yeah, try and create the links between the way we all live and that strangers are someone else's daughter, mum, sister, girlfriend, whatever. That all sounds a bit simplistic, but I think it's the only way to really get messages across, is to let young boys see that this affects people they love as well. But it's not just young boys, it's young girls too, because you do get young girls who tap into some of this in a very strange sort of way. And it ties in too with some of the reports we're seeing about violence from young girls on other young girls. So it's about a respect for each other. And, to pick up on what Mark said about the way that the far right, etc., look at hate crimes and things, they always use that expression, oh, that's just political correctness, blah, 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 blah. It's just a bit of banter. No, it's not. It's the very start of what then escalates and turns into tragedies like we started this piece discussing.
Yeah.
So, yes, I think the Scottish Government are doing rather well on it, and generally with the consensus of the whole Parliament, can I say. Though I've not been there for 5 years, I think this particular Tory bunch are not quite as reasonable as other Tory groups have been. So I think that they're doing what they can on it, but they've got to keep at it. This is a thing that can never be completed. It's ongoing. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Now, moving on to the elections. In 3.5 weeks, voters in Scotland and Wales go to the polls to elect new governments. Plaid Cymru published its manifesto, which highlighted health, childcare, the economy, schools and child poverty. In Scotland, First Minister John Swinney put housing on the agenda. Mr Swinney pledged to provide £10,000 towards a deposit for first-time buyers, establish a new housing agency, and invest £4 billion in affordable housing, as well as deliver 100,000 affordable homes by 2031 and 2032. So, Mark, for Plaid Cymru, what are its plans exactly to eliminate or at least mitigate child poverty for this election?
Well, I think we, before we get into that, I think that what we've done with our manifesto is put together a full programme of government that allows us from day one to start changing Wales. And I think that's something that shows that in all of these areas you've got linked issues. So this isn't a health in isolation, the economy in isolation, education in isolation. You've actually got a very joined up manifesto which shows a party that's serious about governing. So that's the starting point. And I think within that we've had a situation for far too long in Wales, as across the rest of the UK, where child poverty isn't being addressed and sorted in the way that it could and should be. We, like lots of the other parts of the UK, have about 30% of our children who are born into poverty, and this is something that as a society should be absolutely abhorrent to us, and we need to focus on making sure we can do what we can to eliminate it. Now, some of these things are not things that are within the gift of the Welsh Government to do at the moment, unlike in Scotland where some of the benefit system is devolved. We have none of that devolved to us today. So whereas you've got the child payments to support children whose parents are claiming universal credit in Scotland, because you are able to do that because of the devolved settlement, what we're going to be doing is trialling some of that with a view then to go into UK government saying, we know that this does the thing that we said it's going to do, reduce child poverty, and therefore we request the same powers that you have in Scotland to do the same sort of thing. Because cash payments make a real difference and they're appropriate in a way to be able to solve this. We've also got, and this is probably the number one promise that comes out of our manifesto, is that we're going to be offering free childcare to children in Wales, which will enable their parents to both go out to work and be able to contribute to the economy and to society, but also make sure that we deliver high quality childcare. What surprised me when we were researching this is that Wales is the highest childcare cost of the whole of the UK. So by actually putting in something that addresses that directly, we start to be able to build the groundwork to make sure that people believe that they can still contribute and their children can be well cared for while they go to work. So there's some good stuff in there. I think it's one of the things that, like I said, it is a fully formed programme for government, which is what we need to do, and it sets the tone for a party that is, chomping at the bit to get in there and start to change the government. We've had 27 years of, probably best way of describing it, managed decline under Labour. It's clear that they won't be forming the next government. So in Wales, the choice is between a plaid government or a reform government. And as we've talked about for a lot of the time this morning, the distinction between the two is quite stark. One is progressive and will make Wales a better, fairer, kinder place. And the other is the opposite to all of those things, which is hugely depressing. So the stakes are really high in Wales. 3.5 weeks is not long. I think people are increasingly making up their mind to say no to reform and say yes to Plaid Cymru. So I feel very confident as it stands at the moment, and we'll be, knocking every door until May the 7th, and hopefully we'll see a Plaid Cymru government at the back end of it.
Thank you. And so, Linda, John Swinney mentioned this housing agency. What is this housing agency and what does it entail?
Well, I'm desperate to find out. The SNP manifesto launch is on Thursday morning. So there's been a couple of trailers, as you've said. One is the housing agency. One is the £10,000 first time buyers grant. He announced the other day that renters should be given first option if a house is being sold. So there's a lot of things, and I hope I'll see it all coming together when the manifesto is launched, and then when the SNP take government, as I absolutely hope they do, we'll see further detail coming out. I hope the housing agency is not cumbersome, not bureaucratic. I want it to be an enabler. I think that's what Mr. Swinney wishes too, because I've noticed that over the last week or so, he's been at some fairly innovative places looking at housing solutions. He was at Macker Architects in the north of Scotland the other day, looking at their timber-built houses. These are particular houses that can be all built on site from timber, not just timber frames, but timber. So he's looking at all solutions. His current Housing Cabinet Secretary, Mary McCallan, has been given that dedicated role. So can I say, though, that the SNP record in house building, when you compare it to what went before, is actually pretty good, particularly in social housing, not just council housing, many more council houses than the Labour Lib Dem administration did, but social housing in general. The record has been fairly good in tight circumstances in a period of, Mark used the term managed decline. In managed decline in the UK, I think the SNP government has done rather well. So, yes, I'm a housing background myself before I was ever a politician. So I'm looking forward to see what this housing agency will do. I want it to be an enabler. I also want fairly stricter terms to developers when they are building in local authority areas about what they're actually providing. And not being able to, for example, get planning permission with a clause that says you will have so many social houses, and then getting relaxations of that further along the line. There's the terminology of what social housing actually is, but more than anything else, what I would really like to see would be that social housing is on the same level as every other housing. It's not stigmatised in any way. It's not just for those that can't afford to buy a house. It should be a positive choice for people. That's what it used to be. There was no shame at all in having a council house at one time. Margaret Thatcher, but she enabled the right to buy. Some of it was a wee bit there already. And I was really pleased that the SNP government stopped the right to buy. That's the start. But what it did was stigmatise social housing and made it be considered as welfare housing. I would like to see us getting back to social housing being a positive choice for those who don't want to own their own home. And that's a perfectly valid choice in my mind.
Thank you.
Sorry for the rant.
No.
But you get on to housing and I just go into a rant.
There's nothing to apologise for. Thank you. So, Mark, you mentioned that, housing is not that there were some devolved powers that Wales had but Scotland did not have. So for our audience, could you please explain what powers are devolved and reserved in Wales as opposed to Scotland's?
So I don't think we got time to go through that in detail. I think just in summary, when Scotland, what you tend to find is because Scotland had the independence referendum in 2014, that made the UK government at least consider that they need to focus on Scotland to make sure that they don't, leave the Union. And Wales has been for too long. We've doffed our cap and been very supplicant in our relationship with the rest of the UK. And I think what that's meant is that we've had, whereas Scotland has had powers, and we've mentioned powers over the part of the welfare system, which Wales hasn't got, powers over the Crown Estate, which Wales hasn't got, the way that rail, the HS2 monies were provided in a Barnett consequential to Scotland, but they weren't to Wales. There's a bunch of things that are clearly seen by people in Wales as being unfair, that we need to just get into parity with Scotland. The problem we've got is that the MPs who are making those decisions, particularly Labour MPs in Wales, do not agree with that, despite the people of Wales overwhelmingly feeling that way. And I think the difference, what needs to happen now is that once we get hopefully Pree Napier-Warwick as First Minister of Wales and a different attitude to the UK government, he can look behind him and say, I've got 3.1 million people behind me who agree these powers need to be in our gift, and we start making decisions and seeing the benefits and taking hard decisions with those powers as well. Then I think you'll start to see a different Wales. I used the word robust in regards to the far right earlier. I'd use it again in terms of the relationship that I think that a Plaid Cymru government will have with Westminster. I think it will be professional but robust, and that means that we will always know that we'll be standing up for the people of Wales. What's been the biggest shame, I think, of large parts of the devolved settlement with the Welsh Labour Party is that they've been very quick to blame the Tories when the Tories have been in power in Westminster, but have failed absolutely to be able to take the UK Labour government to task when they've treated Wales badly as well. So you've got a situation where you actually need a party and a government that is clear in what its requirements are, and the requirements of Welsh government is to stand up for Wales. I just want to pick up on Linda's point about housing, because I was off camera, but my head was nodding until it almost fell off. I think we underestimate how important housing is to everything, particularly to health. So we have a situation where over 50% of our Welsh Government budget is spent on health. If we gave people the adequate right to housing as a starting point and made that a legal requirement and then delivered against it, you'd start to see some of the key things that affect people's health being addressed at the ground level. It is so important. And I also nodded uncontrollably as well when Linda was saying it's about this stopping this thing where people say, you know, that social housing is almost a welfare house, and we need to get to a point where people it's a positive choice to have a great house built with where the carbon's embedded in that building. So timber housing, I think, is really important in that, and making sure we build houses of superb quality that don't take a lot of money to heat and to run, and to make those a prerequisite. And it's what we did post Second World War, you know, when they had to rebuild like that. And I think we're at a similar emergency position now. At the moment, the only people who get access to a council house have to, you know, to get onto it's an emergency situation. The only way we change that is by building at scale and building council houses at scale. And I think that's something that's hugely, hugely important to everything. So this shows and again, going back to our manifesto, this shows that actually these things are all linked. You can't talk about housing without talking about the impact it has on the health service and the health budget. So, you know, this is, I just wanted to say that, yeah, my head still hurts from that nodding. So.
Mine's doing it too.
So Linda, of course, the election is coming up quite soon. So other than canvassing, how do you think the SNP could increase turnout for voters, especially younger voters? Oh my goodness.
If I knew the answer to that, we'd have done it a long time ago. There is a real issue about non-voter engagement. You know, when I think of the turnout we had at the referendum in 2014, and the turnout we have at elections, general Scottish Parliament elections, and worst of all, council elections, it's quite disheartening. How can the SNP change that? Oh, it's all about encouraging. And when people feel disenfranchised, it's back to one of the discussions we had near the beginning of the programme. When people are feeling down because of all these things happening in the world, in their own continent, in their own country, in their own community, they start to be disenfranchised. And there are those bad players, Reform being one of them, who that suits, because they know their people will turn out. So they're quite happy for folk just to turn away and not bother. I get really upset when I hear people saying, as I do, oh, I'm not interested in politics anymore, there's no point. Because when people stop getting interested, that's when these bad players start to gain traction. What can we do? We do have actually power over elections in Scotland. We have to be careful though, under the rules of the Electoral Commission and everything else, about how we advertise, how we do things to try and make sure people vote. I see a lot of it in social media. I'm not convinced that social media has the big impact that some people think it has in actually translating into action. I don't watch mainstream television anymore, so I don't know whether there are TV adverts and things. I've heard some on the radio. I guess it comes back to education as well, making sure that young people know that they can really have a say in how things work. So it comes back to education, but it also comes back to people feeling part of something and not feeling disenfranchised. It comes back to a well-being, we could go into the well-being economy, but it's about communities that have a sense of well-being and a sense that their vote matters. So it's a job for all of us. We could get into the discussion about compulsory voting, which I guess we don't have time for, but there are issues there as well that are worth looking at.
Of course, thank you, Linda. And so, Mark, before we move on to our final topic of the day, what do you think that Plaid Cymru could do, as I asked Linda, apart from canvassing?
So I just want to inject a bit of hope into this conversation as well at this point, because I think when elections matter, people do get engaged, and we're finding that people are very engaged at this election in Wales. And that's largely because the alternative is actually Reform and what they bring, and then there's a positive differential within Plaid. And we've got some evidence. There was a by-election which got quite a lot of coverage across the UK in Caerphilly last year, where Reform thought they were going to win, and they were beaten by Plaid Cymru, and we ended up with over 50% of the vote and beat them comprehensively. So I think people are starting to recognise that this election counts. I think the other thing, and Linda referenced it as well, young people are really important in this. Young people increasingly are rejecting the politics of division and hate. In Wales, for the past this is the second election, Senate election, where 16 and 17-year-olds can vote. I think they could have a decisive part to play in this election. And one of the things that we're noticing when we're knocking on doors is when a young person answers the doors, whereas previously I may have said, can I speak to your mum and dad? Now I say, how are you going to vote? And that's hugely hope inspiring, something that really does change the dial. So I'm in a place now where I feel like we will have an improved turnout at this election from previous Senate elections, because it matters. There is a choice, and the choice is really stark between the two. And and as I would love it if when we reflect back on it in maybe a year's time, and when the people who look at these things have looked at it and say, do you know what won it? Young people won it. That would be a fantastic testament to this election.
Of course, thank you very much. And our final topic for the day, Artemis 2 returned to Earth on Friday after a 700,000-mile voyage around the moon. So, Linda, with this quite groundbreaking and revolutionary space exploration, do you think Scotland might have a hand in space exploration in the future?
Exploration, I don't know. But what we do have in Scotland, and in fact Glasgow's at the forefront of it, is about, I don't know all the technical terms for all this stuff, it's way beyond me. But we've been building satellites in Scotland for many years. I think Glasgow is the foremost in the UK for this. We've been doing stuff up in the Highlands as well. However, I did notice that the UK government, in the way that they do, has pulled funding for a lot of that stuff. Again, I don't know the detail. So as always, back to the press and mainstream media in our country, people in Scotland do not know the brilliant, innovative stuff that has been done in Scotland. You know, there's a company that's looking at rockets and doing all this technical stuff. We're having tests all over the place. People don't know how brilliant we are at so much that we do. And that ties in with everything we've discussed about having a sense of pride in your country, about having a sense of well-being, that we're at the forefront of things. So will we send John Swinney into space? I don't think so.
Maybe not him. Maybe not him specifically.
But we certainly are right in there in the space race, to go back decades, call it that, and to be, you know, all the stuff with satellite that we use in daily life now. And so from that right through to sending astronauts, we're in there somewhere. And I bet there's a load of Scots Americans working at NASA.
Possibly, yes.
No, possible. Probably.
Probably, yeah. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yes, definitely. So, Mark, do you think that an independent Wales might try its hand at space exploration, or some research into it?
It's been awe-inspiring, hasn't it? I see seeing the pictures that come back, and clearly the astronauts who went up there were able to see things that they'd never seen before. I think I'm just going to urge a note of caution. I think that there's a race that's not just between superpowers now, it's between the billionaire class and the rest of us, in terms of how they want to exploit what's out there. And that worries me personally, and I think that we just need to have a cautionary take on it. But I think there is stuff that we can be doing in our countries that expands technology, and those are things that are really inspiring. Like Linda was referencing, in Scotland, we've got similar groups in Wales who are working on fascinating technologies, that some of which will be, you know, in future moon missions, I'm sure. But, you know, most people need public services that work. And when you can't, just because these things may inspire us and maybe see things going on up there, but when they can't get a hip and knee replacement and things like that, that brings things down to a level that we as politicians need to resolve. And so I'm not going to get too excited by it. I think it's lovely. It's great to see the far side of the moon. I never want to go up there.
Of course. Well, it's not everyone's cup of tea. Well, that is it for this week's Full Scottish. Before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. We can only exist with your support. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. Thank you, and thank you again to our guests Linda Fabiani and Mark Hooper. Thank you very much. Thank you, and goodbye, and thank you for watching.